The sound of laughter from the other side of the door was what made my stomach drop. It wasn't the kind of polite, forced chuckle you give a stranger. It was deep, familiar, the kind of laugh you let out when you're truly comfortable with someone. That laugh belonged to my wife, and it wasn't meant for me. My hand hovered over the doorknob as I stood in the dimly lit hallway, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't supposed to be home this early, but work let out 2 hours ahead of schedule, and I figured I'd surprise Emily with dinner from her favorite Thai place. Instead, I was the one getting surprised. I shifted my weight, pressing my ear against the door, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop myself. The laughter died down, replaced by the murmur of voices, too low to make out the words, but unmistakably intimate. There was a pause, then a sound I recognized instantly, the unmistakable clink of a wine glass being set down on our wooden coffee table. That was when I knew. Emily never drank wine alone, and we never drank it without an occasion. I took a slow breath and pushed the door open, stepping inside with careful, deliberate movements. The scent of her favorite vanilla-scented candles filled the air, blending with something else, cologne. Not mine. Emily was on the couch, her legs tucked under her, looking like she belonged in a magazine, wearing the blue dress I had bought her last Christmas. Sitting across from her, way too close for comfort, was a man I had never seen before. He turned his head toward me, his expression shifting from amusement to something else, surprise, maybe even guilt. Emily stiffened, her lips parting slightly, like she was about to speak, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted to the takeout bag in my hands, then back to my face, and in that moment, I saw it. The panic, the calculation, the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to play this off. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "Didn't expect you home yet," she finally said, her voice light, too casual, like I had just walked in on her watching a movie, not sitting in our living room with another man while I was supposed to be at work. I ignored her and turned my attention to the stranger sitting in my house. He was younger than me, maybe by 5 or 6 years, with an expensive-looking watch on his wrist and the kind of smug confidence that came from knowing he was the one winning in this situation. I wanted to wipe that look off his face. "Who the hell are you?" My voice came out calmer than I felt, but my hands were clenched into fists, the plastic bag crinkling under my grip. Emily shifted uncomfortably on the couch, running a hand through her hair like that would somehow reset the situation. "This is Daniel," she said quickly, as if giving him a name would somehow make it better. "We were just what?" I cut her off, my eyes locked on hers, daring her to say something that wouldn't make me lose it right then and there. Daniel finally spoke, his voice smooth, practiced. "We were just talking," he said, offering me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I work with Emily. She invited me over for a drink after work." I let out a breath, forcing a laugh that had no humor in it. "A drink," I repeated, glancing at the half-empty bottle of wine on the table, the 2 glasses, the way their bodies were angled toward each other like they had been in their own little world before I interrupted. Emily's hand reached for mine, but I stepped back before she could touch me. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice softer now, like she thought she could fix this with the right tone. "He's just a friend." I let the words hang in the air, looking at her, then at him. The way Daniel stayed quiet now, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, told me everything I needed to know. Friends didn't sit like that. Friends didn't look at each other like that. Friends didn't panic when a husband walked in. I placed the takeout bag on the counter, my appetite completely gone. "Get out," I said, my voice so low it almost didn't sound like my own. Daniel hesitated, looking at Emily like she would give him permission to stay. She didn't say anything. Maybe she realized there was no excuse that would make this better. He stood slowly, straightened his shirt, and gave me one last look before walking past me, out the door, without another word. Emily stayed seated, staring down at her hands like they held the answers to whatever excuse she was about to throw at me. I didn't move, just watched her, waiting. Whatever she was about to say, I already knew. It wasn't going to be enough. Emily kept her head down for what felt like forever, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress like she was holding on to something that would stop the inevitable. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a reminder that life outside this moment was still moving. But in here, everything was frozen. I didn't speak, didn't move, just waited. I wanted to see what excuse she would come up with, how she would twist the situation into something less damning, something that would allow her to walk away without facing the weight of what she had done. When she finally looked up, her eyes were already wet, her lips pressing together like she was trying to find the right way to start. "I need you to listen," she said, her voice uneven, the kind of tone someone uses when they know they're at a disadvantage. "It wasn't." "Don't," I interrupted, shaking my head before she could even start. "Don't tell me what it wasn't. I walked in here. I saw how you looked at him. I heard the way you laughed with him. You don't get to sit there and insult me by pretending it wasn't what it clearly was." She inhaled sharply, blinking rapidly like she thought she could will away the tears forming in her eyes. I wasn't moved. She wasn't the one who had just walked into their own home and felt like a stranger. She wasn't the one who had spent the last decade believing in something that, in one moment, had turned into a lie. She wasn't the one standing here wondering how long she had been sneaking around, wondering how many times she had smiled at me, kissed me, told me she loved me while secretly thinking about someone else. "Please," she tried again, shifting on the couch like she wanted to get up but wasn't sure if she should. "It's not as bad as you think." I let out a breath, laughing without any real amusement. "Not as bad as I think," I repeated, feeling my nails dig into my palm. "So you're saying you weren't alone with him in our house, drinking wine, looking like you were about to?" "I wasn't," she cut in, too fast, too defensive, the kind of denial that wasn't about proving innocence but about trying to minimize guilt. "I mean, look, I know how it looked, but you came in at the wrong time. We were just talking. Just talking." I repeated the words slowly, tasting them, letting them sit in the air between us. "Then why did you look guilty? Why did he hesitate when I told him to leave? Why does it feel like if I had come home 30 minutes later, I would have walked into something even worse?" Emily exhaled hard, rubbing her hands over her face before dropping them into her lap, shaking her head like she was trying to make sense of it all. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe me," she finally admitted, looking up at me with an expression that was equal parts frustration and desperation. "Because you always assumed the worst." I stared at her, feeling something inside me snap. "I always assumed the worst," I repeated, stepping forward, closing the space between us. "Tell me, Emily, when was the last time I accused you of something like this? When was the last time I doubted you, questioned your loyalty, treated you like you were sneaking around? Because I can tell you right now, in 11 years, not once have I ever felt the need to do that. So don't sit there and try to make this my fault. You don't get to turn this around on me." She swallowed hard, looking down again, and I could see the way her chest rose and fell, the way she was trying to keep herself together, trying to come up with something, anything, that would make this go away. But there was nothing. She had been caught, and she knew it. "I just needed someone to talk to," she finally muttered, her voice small, like that explanation would be enough. "Talk to," I repeated, my voice sharper now, the anger that had been simmering beneath my skin finally breaking through. "You needed someone to talk to, so instead of talking to me, your husband, you decided to invite some guy over while I was at work, open a bottle of wine, sit close enough to him that it looked like something out of a goddamn romance movie? That's what you're telling me." Emily flinched at my tone, but I didn't care. She didn't get to play the victim in this. She didn't get to act like I was being unreasonable for reacting exactly how any sane person would in this situation. "He's just a coworker," she insisted, voice shaking now. "He was having a rough day, and I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Stop," I said, shaking my head. "Just stop. I don't give a damn how his day was. I don't care what excuse you think justifies this. What I care about is the fact that you lied to me, that you did something behind my back, that you sat there, knowing exactly how this would look, and you still chose to do it. So don't sit here and try to make this about him needing comfort. This is about you choosing to cross a line you never should have crossed." Emily exhaled shakily, running a hand through her hair, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I didn't sleep with him," she said, and for the first time since this conversation started, her voice cracked. I stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time, I realized something that made my stomach twist even tighter. She hadn't denied wanting to. She hadn't said that it had never been a possibility. She had only said that it hadn't happened yet. I let out a slow breath, stepping back, putting distance between us because if I didn't, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. "You didn't sleep with him," I repeated, nodding slightly. "Not yet." Emily's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting like she wanted to deny it, but she didn't. She couldn't. I clenched my jaw, shaking my head as I turned away from her, running a hand over my face, trying to push back the rage threatening to consume me. I need to get out of here, I muttered, my voice tight. Wait. Emily started, but I didn't. I grabbed my keys off the counter, walked to the door, and stepped outside without looking back. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do now. I drove for an hour without any real destination, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The city lights blurred past me as I tried to push down the feeling that had settled in my chest, the kind of suffocating weight that made it hard to think straight. I wanted to believe that I had misread the situation, that maybe Emily was telling the truth, that maybe I had jumped to conclusions too quickly, but the look on her face, the hesitation, the guilt, it all told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't denied wanting to take things further. She hadn't even been angry that I accused her. She had just been scared that I had caught her before she had a chance to finish what she started. I pulled into a parking lot outside a small bar that looked half empty, the kind of place where people went to disappear for a few hours. I wasn't a heavy drinker, never had been, but right now, I needed something to dull the thoughts running through my head. Inside, the place was dimly lit, smelling like cheap beer and stale smoke, with a handful of people scattered around the booths and bar stools. I found a seat in the corner, ordered a whiskey neat, and stared at the glass like it held the answer to my problem. Halfway through my drink, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it at first, but when it kept vibrating, I pulled it out and saw Emily's name lighting up the screen. I stared at it, debating whether I even wanted to hear what she had to say, but eventually, I answered, holding the phone to my ear without saying a word. "I don't know where you are," she said after a few seconds of silence, her voice uneven like she had been crying. "But you need to come home so we can talk." I took a slow breath, rolling the glass between my fingers. "Talk about what, Emily?" I asked, my voice flat. "How you were alone in our house with another man. How you lied to me. How you looked at me like I was the problem when I walked in." She let out a shaky exhale, and for a moment, I thought she was going to hang up, but then she spoke again, quieter this time. "I know how it looked, but you have to believe me when I say it wasn't what you think." I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. "What I think," I repeated slowly. "Emily, what I think is that if I had come home an hour later, I would have walked in on something a hell of a lot worse. And you know that. That's why you won't admit it." She went silent, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, quick and unsteady, like she was trying to find the right words but couldn't. That silence told me more than anything she could have said. If she had nothing to feel guilty about, she would have fought harder. She would have defended herself instead of just waiting for me to let her off the hook. "I don't know what you want me to say," she finally muttered, and there was something in her tone, something that made my grip tighten around the glass. "I want you to tell me the truth," I said, my voice sharper now, no longer willing to dance around it. "Tell me how long this has been going on. Tell me how many times he's been in our house. Tell me if this is the first guy or just the first one I caught." Emily sucked in a breath, and for a second, I thought she was about to admit it, but then she let out a frustrated sound instead. "You don't even want to listen to me," she snapped. "You've already made up your mind. So what's the point of this?" "The point," I said, my jaw tightening, "is that I deserve to know if my wife has been cheating on me. That's the point, Emily." More silence. Longer this time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, but there was something in it that sent a chill through me. "I didn't cheat," she said carefully, like she was picking each word with precision. "But maybe I wanted to." The room felt colder. The sounds of the bar faded into the background. I stared at the wood grain on the table in front of me, trying to process what I had just heard. Maybe I wanted to. Not a denial. Not an excuse. Just an admission that was somehow worse than if she had actually done it. I set the glass down carefully, my fingers pressing against my forehead as I let out a slow breath. "So that's it then," I said, my voice almost too calm. "You just wanted to see how far you could push it before I noticed?" "That's not fair," she snapped, her voice rising now, defensive. "You act like I planned this, like I set out to hurt you. I didn't. She cut herself off, exhaling hard. "I don't know what's wrong with me, okay? I don't know why I let it get this far. But I swear to you, nothing happened." I leaned back in my seat, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before shaking my head. "You know what, Emily?" I muttered, standing up and throwing a few bills onto the table. It doesn't matter anymore. Wait, she started, but I had already hung up. I walked outside, inhaling the cold night air, trying to clear my head, but all I could think about was the fact that my wife, the person I had trusted more than anyone, had just admitted that she had wanted to betray me. Maybe she hadn't crossed the final line yet, but she had been ready to. And the worst part was, she hadn't even sounded sure that she wouldn't do it again. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people go when they have nowhere else to be, and paid for a room in cash. The guy at the front desk barely looked up as he handed me the key, uninterested in whatever had brought me there. I walked into the small, dimly lit room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall, trying to process everything. Emily had admitted it. She hadn't cheated, but she had wanted to. That was enough. That was worse in some ways. It meant she had already disconnected from me, had already imagined a life where she let herself cross that line, and the only thing that had stopped her was circumstance, not loyalty. That wasn't something I could just push aside. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. She had called me 4 times since I had hung up on her, sent text after text, but there was nothing left to say. I had heard the truth from her own mouth. That was all I needed. I lay back on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time I had felt genuinely happy in my marriage. But the memories felt distant, blurred at the edges. Maybe I had been blind for longer than I realized. Sleep never really came. I dozed in and out, my body exhausted but my mind refusing to shut down, replaying every moment, every small sign I had ignored. When morning finally came, I got up, splashed cold water on my face, and left without bothering to check out. I drove aimlessly for a while, not ready to go home, not ready to face Emily and whatever weak excuse she had prepared overnight. But eventually, I ran out of places to go. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was still there, and I knew she had been waiting. I barely made it inside before she was in front of me, eyes red, hair messy, like she hadn't slept either. She looked desperate, like she wanted to reach for me, but knew better. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I shut the door behind me, tossing my keys onto the counter. "Does it matter?" She flinched, but didn't back down. "Of course it matters. You disappeared. I didn't know where you were. I was worried." I let out a sharp breath, shaking my head. "Worried? That's funny, Emily. You weren't worried about me when you were sitting in this house with him, drinking wine, making plans in your head about whether or not you were going to sleep with him." She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, like she was trying to hold back the emotions threatening to spill over. "I told you, nothing happened. And I told you that doesn't matter." I snapped, stepping closer, forcing her to look at me. "You wanted it to happen. You thought about it. You considered it. That's worse. You didn't cheat because you love me. You didn't cheat because you got caught before you could." Her breath hitched, and I saw the moment my words hit her, but I didn't feel bad. She deserved this. She deserved to know exactly how much she had broken something that could never be fixed. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. "Then don't say anything," I said flatly. "Just tell me why, Emily. Tell me why, after 11 years, after everything, you let yourself get to this point." She swallowed hard, shifting her weight like she wanted to run. "I don't know," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I had a better answer. I wish I could tell you it was because of something specific, something that we could fix. But I don't have that. I felt something missing. I don't even know what it was. And for a moment, when I was with him, I thought maybe I had found it." The words knocked the air out of my lungs. I had prepared myself for a lot of things, for excuses, for blame, for deflection. But I hadn't prepared for that. She wasn't just admitting that she had wanted to cheat. She was admitting that she had been searching for something else, something she thought she had lost with me. I nodded slowly, letting her words settle, feeling something inside me crack. "So that's it, then," I said, voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You were looking for something else. Something you didn't think you could get from me anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head quickly. "That's not what I meant. I wasn't looking to replace you. I wasn't. But you were." I cut in, not letting her finish. "You might not have been actively searching, but the second you thought you found something better, something exciting, you didn't stop yourself. You let it happen." She covered her mouth with her hand, closing her eyes like she couldn't bear to hear it, but I wasn't going to stop. You want to know what the worst part is? I continued, my voice quieter now, more controlled. If I hadn't walked in, if I hadn't caught you before you got too far, you wouldn't have felt guilty. You wouldn't be standing here crying. You'd be sneaking around, lying to me, pretending everything was fine. And I would be the idiot who never saw it coming. A sob broke free from her, her shoulders shaking. But I just stood there, watching, feeling nothing. No sympathy, no anger, just emptiness. I don't know what to do, she whispered. I let out a slow breath, looking at her, really looking at her. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't see my wife. I saw a woman who had already left our marriage long before I caught her. She had just been waiting for something to push her over the edge. And maybe I had just given her the excuse she needed. I stepped back, creating more distance between us. I do, I said, my voice calm, final. I'm done. Her head snapped up, her eyes widening in panic. No, wait. But I didn't. I turned, walked into the bedroom, and started pulling clothes out of the drawers. I wasn't going to waste another second pretending that what we had could be saved. Emily followed me into the bedroom, her footsteps quick, her voice breaking as she spoke. You don't mean that, she said, her breath uneven, her body tense like she was ready to fight against what was happening. You're angry, I get it, but you can't just throw everything away over one mistake. I pulled an empty duffel bag from the closet, tossing it onto the bed before opening drawers and grabbing clothes. I didn't stop to look at her, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me hesitate, because I wasn't hesitating. One mistake, I repeated, shoving a handful of shirts into the bag. You didn't trip and fall into an affair, Emily. You didn't just make some bad decision in the heat of the moment. You let yourself get to a place where this was even an option. You didn't stop yourself because you didn't want to. She ran a hand through her hair, stepping forward, voice desperate now. I didn't sleep with him. I finally turned to face her, letting my anger show for the first time. You think that makes this better? I snapped. You think the fact that you didn't physically cheat erases everything else? You wanted to, Emily. You stood in this house, in our home, drinking wine with him, knowing exactly where it was leading, and you didn't care. Not until I walked in. Her bottom lip trembled, her hands balling into fists at her sides. I care now, she whispered. I care now because I see what I almost lost. I see what I did to you. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head before turning back to the bag, grabbing more of my things. Too late, I said simply. She stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm, her fingers trembling. Please, don't do this, she begged, voice barely above a whisper. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can. I yanked my arm away, zipping up the bag before throwing it over my shoulder. We're not fixing anything, I said, walking past her. You made sure of that. She followed me as I moved down the hallway, her voice rising now, panic setting in. So that's it, she demanded. You're just leaving? You're not even going to try. I stopped at the door, gripping the handle but not turning it just yet. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at her from the corner of my eye. I tried for 11 years, Emily, I said, my voice steady. You're the one who gave up. Her face crumpled, but I didn't stay to watch the tears fall. I opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind me without looking back. I sat in my car for a few minutes after closing the door behind me, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to figure out what came next. Leaving had felt right, necessary even, but now that I was out, I had no plan. I had spent years building a life with Emily, trusting her, believing we were solid, and now I was sitting in my car with nothing but a duffel bag of clothes and the weight of knowing that everything I thought I had was already gone before I even walked in on her and Daniel. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and scrolled through my contacts before stopping on the one person I knew wouldn't ask too many questions. Yeah. The voice on the other end was groggy, irritated, like I had woken him up, which I probably had. I need a place to crash, I said, rubbing a hand over my face. There was a pause, then a sigh. Tell me you didn't finally kill someone. I almost laughed, but there was no humor left in me. Not yet, I muttered. Another pause. Come over, he said. Doors open. I ended the call and started the car, backing out of the driveway without glancing at the house. Emily was probably still standing in the doorway, watching, hoping I'd turn around, but I wasn't going to give her that. She had done enough damage, and I wasn't interested in making it easier for her by pretending this was something we could talk through. Some things, once broken, stayed broken. By the time I pulled up to Ryan's apartment, the exhaustion was starting to hit me. I hadn't really slept, hadn't eaten since the night before, but none of that mattered. I just needed to be anywhere but home. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the door, pushing it open without knocking. Ryan was sitting on the couch, his hair a mess, a half-empty beer in his hand despite the fact that it was barely past noon. "Figured you'd be here sooner or later," he said, watching as I dropped my bag near the door and sat down on the other couch. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, staring at nothing. "She admitted it," I said after a moment. "Didn't cheat, but wanted to." Ryan let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "That's worse," he muttered, taking a sip of his beer. "Cheating, at least, is just a mistake. Wanting to means she was already out." I exhaled hard, shaking my head. "I don't even know when it started," I admitted. "I don't know if this was the first guy, if she's been looking for an excuse to leave for years, or if she just woke up one day and decided I wasn't enough anymore." Ryan was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "Does it matter?" I looked over at him, frowning. "Of course it matters." He shook his head. "No, it doesn't. Because at the end of the day, she did what she did. Doesn't matter if it started last week or last year. Doesn't change the fact that she let herself get there." I didn't have a response to that, because he was right. It didn't change anything. Emily had already checked out of our marriage before I even knew there was a problem, and that was what stung the most. "So what now?" Ryan asked, setting his beer down on the coffee table. "You staying here for a while?" I let out a slow breath, leaning back against the couch. "Just until I figure out what's next." He nodded, like he had expected that answer. "You talked to a lawyer yet?" "Not yet," I admitted. He raised an eyebrow. "You planning on dragging this out?" I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. "No," I said finally. "I'm filing as soon as possible." Ryan nodded again, then stood up, stretching. "Good," he said. "Because if you even considered giving her another chance, I'd have to kick your ass." I huffed out a laugh, shaking my head. "Not happening." "Damn right it's not," he muttered, walking toward the kitchen. "You want a beer?" I thought about it, then nodded. "Yeah," I said. "Why not?" And just like that, it was done. Emily was my past now. What came next, I didn't know. But whatever it was, it wouldn't include her.